All right, so today we're going deep on some pretty thought-provoking stuff. We're diving into a lecture by Dr. Mohammed Shahrur.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Shahrur.
This guy is known for some, shall we say, unconventional interpretations of Islam and the Quran.
Right.
So we've got one main source for you today. It's a YouTube video of a lecture that he gave at the Sorbonne University.
Wow. The Sorbonne.
Yeah, and it's followed by like a Q&A session.
Oh, cool.
So it's a lot of really fascinating stuff.
Well, you know what's really interesting is that he kicks off this lecture by talking about the Arab defeat in the 1967 war.
Oh, wow. So he doesn't just jump into, abstract theology or anything.
No.
He's grounding this whole argument in something very specific in history. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think he was really struck by how both religious and political figures tried to explain the defeat at the time.
Oh,
some were blaming it on, you're not going to believe this women's clothing.
What, women's clothing?
Yeah, there were some people saying that women were dressed yet naked.
Oh.
And that this somehow angered God and led to the defeat. Others pointed to the fact that the war took place during Ramadan.
Oh, so the timing of it.
Yeah, as if that was the issue.
Wow. So it seems like he saw these explanations as like symptoms of a much bigger problem.
Exactly. He called it a problem with the Arab collective mind. He felt that, this defeat and then the way that it was rationalized revealed this tendency to rely on interpretations from centuries ago instead of engaging with the Quran directly.
Yeah, he even tells this story in the lecture about how people were telling him that to understand the Quran, he had to read books written by scholars from 1,200 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So he's basically being told to not trust his own reading of the text.
Yeah, he definitely challenges that reliance on traditional authority.
Interesting.
And this leads us into his own approach to reading the Quran, which is quite radical.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Yeah.
What makes his approach so different?
So he's got these three core assumptions that kind of form the basis of his whole interpretation.
Okay.
First, he believes that the Quran is incredibly precise, with no redundancy in the word usage at all.
So every word is very carefully chosen.
Every word is chosen and carries a very specific meaning.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so understanding those nuances is like crucial to his interpretation.
Interesting. What's his second assumption then?
Well, this is where it gets really controversial.
Yeah.
He argues that if you eliminate redundancy in the Arabic language, the entire system of Islamic jurisprudence as it currently exists falls apart.
Well, hold on. He's basically saying that centuries of legal interpretations are based on like a misunderstanding of the language.
It's a huge claim.
Yeah, it is.
And it gets even more complex with this third assumption.
Okay.
He believes that the Quran itself is only part of like a larger book.
Oh, wow.
That's referenced in Islamic texts, so we don't have the full picture.
So almost like a lost text that is being referred to.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so he's got these assumptions. Does he offer any evidence, though, to back these things up?
Oh, he does. He dives deep into the definitions of terms like Quran, Furqan, the Ten Commandments, and Diq.
All terms that are, central to Islamic belief.
Very central, yeah.
Is he saying that they've been misinterpreted? Or what's his take?
He's saying they haven't been fully understood in their original context.
Okay.
And this is where he makes another bold claim.
Oh, boy.
He believes that the Prophet Muhammad didn't explain the Quran's verses in detail.
Really? Because that goes against a lot of traditional Islamic thought, right?
Absolutely.
So what's he saying? That people should just disregard the Prophet's teaching altogether?
No, not at all. He's just suggesting that the Prophet left the interpretation open for future generations to grapple with using their own intellect. It's a call for individual engagement with the text.
So he's shifting the emphasis.
He is.
But not saying to disregard the Prophet completely. Really? That brings us to another really interesting point. And that's this concept of universality in Islam.
Right.
He seems to have a bit of a problem with that idea.
He challenges it head on. He asks, where is the universality of Islam in Tokyo or Los Angeles?
Huh. So he wants to see the evidence of this.
He wants to see it.
Beyond just claims.
Beyond claims.
Okay, so is he saying that Islam is not a universal religion?
Not exactly. He's just pushing people to move beyond vague notions of universality and actually grapple with like the real world implications of Islamic teachings.
Okay, so he's saying we need to look at the evidence.
Right.
And then he goes on to argue that Prophet Muhammad's message broke with previous prophets in a few very significant ways.
Yeah, this is where his interpretation gets really interesting.
Okay.
He argues that the Prophet Muhammad sealed divine legislation by finalizing prohibitions.
Okay.
So that means, unlike earlier prophets, Muhammad was the last to be able to say what is and isn't allowed in Islam.
Oh, so that's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
What else does he say about how Prophet Muhammad's message differed?
He argues that Prophet Muhammad ushered in an era of pluralistic societies, so
Right.
he acknowledged the validity of diverse beliefs.
That's huge.
Right. Which is a major departure from the idea of one true religion dominating all others.
And then on top of that, he says that the prophet ended the era of masculinity.
Yes. He
Yeah.
calls it the beginning of an era of equality between men and women, especially when it comes to responsibility and inheritance.
Now, this is something that I'm really curious about.
Yeah.
How does he support this claim?
That's a great question, and it gets into some really interesting areas of interpretation.
Okay.
But before we go there, I think it's important to understand Dr. Shahrur's perspective on how Islamic thought kind of evolved after the Prophet.
Okay, so let's dig into that.
Okay.
How did Islamic thought evolve after the prophet?
Well, he really focuses on the influence of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates.
Okay.
These are two major dynasties that ruled after the Prophet's death. And he argues that they played a huge role in shaping the form of Islam that we know today.
So he's saying they had a big impact on how the Quran was interpreted and applied.
Absolutely.
Okay.
He argues that the Umayyads in particular,
Okay.
and they ruled from 661 to 750 CE,
All right.
they were particularly influential in shaping the concept of qadara and qadar.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Right. Divine decree and predestination.
Can you remind me what that means? It's like predestiny, right?
Essentially, yeah. It's the idea that everything is predetermined by God, including who rules and what happens in the world.
Okay.
And Dr. Shahrur says they use this to legitimize their own rule.
So basically saying, hey, we're in charge because God willed it.
Exactly.
Like they don't even question us.
Exactly. It's a pretty convenient interpretation.
Yeah, that is convenient.
Right. And then along came the Abbasids.
Okay.
They ruled from 750 to 1258 CE.
Okay.
And Dr. Shahrur argues that they played a key role in solidifying the form of Islam that we see today. He points to the influence of four prominent Islamic jurists: Malik, Abu Hanifa, Shafi, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
So these were the jurists that really codified Islamic law.
They had a huge influence, but it's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Dr. Shahrur also argues that the Abbasid era saw a growing influence of Christianity on Islamic thought.
That's really concerning. I didn't realize there was so much like interaction between the two religions at the time.
Right. But remember, the Abbasid Empire was this center of intellectual and cultural exchange.
Oh, right.
So there was a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this is where Dr. Shahrur introduces this idea of a deception.
Oh, a deception. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, he claims that during this period, the center of Islam shifted
Okay.
from the Quran
Okay.
to the Prophet Muhammad himself, much like Christianity focuses on Jesus.
So he's saying that instead of emphasizing the message of the Quran, they started focusing more on the life and actions of the prophet.
Exactly. He sees this emphasis on the Sunnah, the Prophet's actions and sayings, as a second revelation.
Oh, wow.
That eventually overshadowed the Quran's teachings.
So the Sunnah became more important than the Quran almost.
In a way. Yeah.
He believes that this shift led to a kind of stagnation.
Yeah.
Stagnation. In what way?
He argues that people became so focused on imitating the Prophet that they lost sight of the Quran's core message.
Okay.
7th century lifestyles and customs became synonymous with Islam, which he thinks has hindered societal progress.
Oh, wow. So he's making a very direct connection
Yeah.
between this shift in focus and a lack of progress in the Muslim world.
Right.
Wow.
And to illustrate this, he points to the 5 pillars of Islam.
Right. The declaration of faith, prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage
Yes,
to Mecca.
exactly.
So what's his take on them?
He suggests that while those pillars are important,
Right.
they've become more about ritual than embodying the Quran's message of belief in one God and doing good deeds. Like, the focus has shifted away from the core principles.
Interesting. Okay, so where does he go from there? Does he offer an alternative?
He does.
An alternative understanding of Islam?
He does. He redefines Islam based solely on those Quranic principles.
Yeah.
Belief in one God and doing good deeds,
Okay.
regardless of what religious label you might use.
Wow, so he's really stripping away centuries of interpretations and cultural additions
Yeah.
to get back to what he sees as like the essence of the Quran's message.
He is, and this is where the Q&A portion of his lecture becomes really fascinating because people start challenging him on some of these very bold claims.
Okay, now I'm hooked. What kinds of questions do they ask him?
They grill him on everything from different religions to marriage, inheritance, the concept of slavery in Islam, and even the role of society in enforcing morality.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
So how does he handle these tough questions?
Oh, he handles them head on.
Okay.
And that's where you really see his intellectual agility. Like right away, someone asks him about, does he believe that different religions are suited for different cultures? Like Islam is for Arabs, Hinduism is for Indians, that sort of thing.
So he's being challenged on this idea of cultural relativism versus, universal truths.
Yeah.
What's his response?
He rejects it outright.
He does.
He says that the divine message as he sees it is universal.
Okay.
It's not bound by cultural boundaries.
So he's sticking to his guns.
Oh, yeah.
About this core message of Islam applying to everyone.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then he goes on to address questions about specific Islamic concepts and practices.
Okay.
And some of his interpretations are like really challenging to traditional understandings.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, someone brings up the terms in etch and itch in relation to marriage.
Oh.
These are terms that often come up in discussions about dowry and, financial responsibilities within a marriage.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that terms.
Okay.
Can you break them down for me?
Sure. So oynish is often translated as giving a woman her due,
Okay.
while enio means like giving a woman her wages.
Okay, so they both seem to relate to a woman's financial entitlement,
Yeah.
but there's a subtle difference.
Exactly. And Dr. Shahrur really emphasizes that difference.
Okay.
He says that onyo refers to a woman's right to financial security and support within the marriage,
Right.
while onyu implies more of a transactional arrangement like wages for work.
So he's saying that a woman's financial well-being in a marriage is like a right,
Yes.
not like a payment for services.
That's his interpretation.
Interesting.
And it definitely pushes back against some traditional views on the economics of marriage in Islam.
This is where I think his approach to interpreting the Quran gets really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Because he's not just like accepting the traditional understandings, he's questioning them. He's digging deeper into the language, and then he's coming up with interpretations that align with his own understanding of the Quran's core message.
You hit the nail on the head. And perhaps the most controversial example of this is how he addresses the concept of only.
I've heard that term before,
Right?
but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Yeah, it's often translated as those your right hand possesses.
Okay.
And it's been used historically to justify the practice of slavery within Islam.
That's a really sensitive topic.
Very sensitive.
So how does he address it?
Well, instead of accepting that traditional understanding of unliye as like outright slavery,
Okay.
he argues that it represents a contract between free individuals.
Okay.
He suggests that it refers to situations where someone willingly enters into a service agreement with another person in exchange for compensation.
So he's essentially reinterpreting this phrase.
Yes.
To align with his belief that Islam fundamentally opposes slavery.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he goes on to talk about the gradual abolition of slavery throughout history,
Okay.
emphasizing the role of public opinion in driving that change.
And he even gets into some historical comparisons here.
Yeah.
He talks about, the abolition of slavery in Saudi Arabia and contrasts it with other parts of the world.
Right. He points out that slavery was officially abolished in Saudi Arabia in 1964,
Okay.
but he suggests that it was more due to political pressure than genuine internal social change.
I see. So he sees this as a lag
Yeah.
in social progress.
Yes.
When it comes to this issue.
On this issue in the Arab world.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
And then he brings up the Zanzibar Revolution, too.
Right.
Which is a very complex and tragic event.
It is.
So can you remind us what happened there?
So in 1964, there was a revolution in Zanzibar
Okay.
that involved the massacre of thousands of Arabs,
Wow.
many of whom were descendants of slave traders.
So it's a horrific example of, the long-lasting consequences of historical injustice.
Exactly.
What point do you think he's trying to make by bringing this up?
I think he's reminding the audience that these issues are not just abstract theological debates. They have real-world implications and, deeply intertwined history.
So he's not shying away from the tough stuff.
Not at all.
Okay.
And then he goes on to address the challenges faced by women in like contemporary society.
Okay.
For example, he discusses the Quran's stance on single mothers.
What does he say about that?
He emphasizes the right of every woman to be a mother,
Okay.
regardless of societal norms or marital status.
Okay.
He argues that the Quran supports this right and challenges those traditional views that stigmatize single mothers.
So again, he's offering a more inclusive
Yes,
understanding of Islam.
absolutely.
What else does he address in this Q&A?
Well, someone asks about those so-called detailed verses in the Quran,
Okay.
the ones that deal with specific situations and rulings.
So how does he approach those? Does he interpret them literally?
He explains that those detailed verses should be understood in context,
Okay.
as applications of general principles outlined elsewhere in the Quran.
Isaac.
He's essentially saying, don't just take these verses in isolation, right? You have to connect them back to the broader framework of Islamic teachings.
So it's not about blind obedience to specific rules,
No,
but rather about understanding the reasoning behind them.
exactly.
Okay.
And this leads to a discussion about the 6 categories of fawahish,
Okay.
which means immoral acts or abominations.
Okay.
It's a term used in the Quran to describe certain behaviors that are considered morally wrong.
So does he believe that society should strictly enforce these prohibitions?
He actually takes a more nuanced approach.
Okay.
He emphasizes the limited role of societal intervention
Okay.
in matters of personal morality.
So he's drawing a line between personal choices
Yeah.
and the role of society enforcing certain behaviors.
Exactly.
Well-
He's saying that individuals should be free to make their own choices,
Okay.
as long as they don't harm others.
Okay, so this seems very individualistic.
Yes, very much so.
What other challenging concepts does he address?
He tackles the concept of kuf,
Okay.
which is often translated as disbelief, and has been used to label those who are considered outside the fold of Islam.
Right. So very loaded term.
Very low.
Potentially divisive.
Yeah.
What's his take on it?
He argues that kufr doesn't necessarily mean disbelief in God.
Okay.
He says it can also represent enmity or opposition,
I see.
and he emphasizes that the meaning of kufr depends on the context.
So again, pushing back against rigid interpretations.
Exactly.
It's like we need to be careful about how we use these terms.
Yes. And he ends the Q&A with this really powerful statement
Okay.
about individual freedom and responsibility.
Okay.
He reminds the audience that each person is ultimately accountable to God for their own choices and actions.
So it sounds like he's really empowering individuals
Yeah,
to take ownership of their faith
absolutely.
and to live according to their own understanding of the Quran's message.
That's a great way to put it.
Interesting.
He's not just offering interpretations.
Right.
He's advocating for a way of engaging with faith. That emphasizes individual responsibility and intellectual exploration.
I'm really struck by his courage
Yeah.
to challenge traditional interpretations
Mm-hmm.
and to encourage critical thinking.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from controversial topics at all.
He doesn't.
And he's not afraid to offer interpretations that might be unpopular with some.
No, he's not.
But whether people agree with him or not, I think he's definitely sparked a conversation.
Absolutely. He's not afraid to question authority,
Yeah.
offer new interpretations, and really push people to think critically about their faith.
I'm curious what stood out to you the most about his lecture in the Q&A.
You know what really struck me was his constant emphasis on individual responsibility and intellectual engagement.
Yeah.
Like, he's not saying just follow blindly.
Right.
He's saying think for yourselves,
Yeah.
question assumptions,
Mm.
and wrestle with these complex ideas.
And that's such an important message.
It is.
That goes beyond just religion, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
It applies to how we approach any belief system, any ideology.
Right. It's about cultivating a mindset of curiosity, critical thinking, and, a willingness to engage with different perspectives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Dr. Shahrur's lecture, I think we're left with some big questions for ourselves.
Yeah.
Do his interpretations challenge or change how you understand Islam and its history?
What are the implications of shifting the focus back to the Quran itself, as he suggests, and moving away from those centuries of layered interpretations?
And this idea of pluralistic societies,
Right.
how does that challenge traditional views within Islam?
I think these are questions worth pondering.
Yeah.
We encourage you to explore Dr. Shahrur's work further.
Yeah.
Maybe have some conversations with friends or family about these ideas.
Right.
What resonates with you? What do you find challenging?
That's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
Exactly.
It's not about finding all the answers.
Right.
It's about sparking curiosity,
Yeah.
prompting reflection, and maybe even shifting our perspectives a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
And who knows, I might lead you down some fascinating intellectual rabbit holes.
Exactly. Remember, the journey of understanding is never truly over.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. You know, he doesn't really have this grand dramatic conclusion or anything. It's more like he just drops this intellectual bombshell and then lets it reverberate.
Okay, I like that. Give us the bombshell.
So he links these interpretations of his back to, you know, modern problems
Okay.
facing Muslims.
Okay.
You know, he's not just talking about ancient history
Right.
or abstract theology. He's drawing this direct connection between his understanding of the Quran
Okay.
and the challenges of today.
So is he suggesting that if Muslims kind of recentered their faith around the Quran,
Yeah.
as he interprets it, that it could actually lead to positive change,
Yeah.
like social and political change?
I think that's the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
He sees his approach as a way to break free from what he believes is like centuries of stagnation in Islamic thought. He thinks that returning to the Quran's core principles, belief in one God and doing good deeds can create a more just,
Okay.
equitable world.
That's a pretty bold claim
It is.
to say that, like, his interpretation holds the key to solving these huge problems.
Yeah, it's definitely bold,
Yeah.
but that's also what makes his work so fascinating.
Right.
And frankly, so controversial.
Yeah.
He's challenging long-held beliefs,
Right.
traditions within Islam,
Yeah.
and not everyone's going to be on board with that.
But I think whether people agree with him or not,
Yeah.
he's definitely sparked a conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to question authority,
Right.
offer new interpretations, and, really push people to think critically about their faith.
Well, that's what we try to do here
Exactly.
on this show, right?
That's right.
We want to get people thinking critically about these ideas. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the work of Dr. Shahrur.
Yeah, this was a great one.
And we hope you learned something new
We always do.
and challenging.
Challenging for sure.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you later.